Hello, I'm Dr. Nick Mueller, President and CEO of the National World War II Museum until last Friday. This is my first day of a new chapter as President and CEO Emeritus of the National World War II Museum, and I know there's over 250,000 followers out there, and a few of you might be watching this today. And as we move forward into the future, we'll be having several transmissions, streaming video, as they say, to tell you a little bit about the museum, its authors, its future, and some of the great milestones that we are experiencing now and in the days ahead. For those of our members, donors, friends, enthusiasts who are out there, you should know there's a lot in store for you here at the World War II Museum in the years ahead. This fall we break ground on the Hall of Democracy, which is going to be able to bring you all kinds of streaming programs all throughout the year. Right after that is the Liberation Pavilion, which is the post-war legacy of World War II, and we're going to have that open in about 3 years. Hall of Democracy in 2 years. And for those of you still coming to New Orleans, we're breaking ground on a Higgins Hotel and Conference Center, and right next to the museum, and you'll have a place to stay when you come. And I think everybody in that group out there that's watching now knows why we named it the Higgins Hotel and Conference Center. So that'll be waiting for you in a couple of years, but don't wait that long. Well, from Founders Corner today, we have the pleasure of having one of my closest friends going back to the 60s. We were in graduate school together. We both went on as professors of history, me at the University of New Orleans, and Dr. Julian Pleasance, who went to the University of Florida, and a distinguished historian and speaker and lecturer, winner of countless teaching awards during those years. Served on this museum's presidential counselors for a number of years, and have been one of my great confidants over those years, as well as friend. Now he's here to talk about his new book on the Homefront, and all of you out there in Facebook land are somewhere in somebody's home area, which was certainly involved in World War II. And here's a copy of his new book. This is the Homefront, North Carolina during World War II. Now I know all of you aren't in North Carolina, but you will find this fascinating even if you aren't. And his publisher, the University of Florida Press, has said this is an expensive book because it took them a long time to research. It's normally $89, so we don't want it to sell for that. So his publisher has offered, if you got a pen and write this down, the letters AU 717 is the code that'll give you this same book for $45.
Correct.
If you call 1-800-226-3822. The full title is The Homefront, North Carolina during World War II, and it's an amazing read, and you all will just absolutely love it. We're going to start off by asking Julian to tell us a little bit about the impact of World War II on the home front of North Carolina during the war, and we'll take a few minutes on that, and then we're going to jump into some of the very interesting anecdotes and stories that were so critical for North Carolina's role in World War II. And every state had a story just like North Carolina. And so we've got this one, and Blue's going to tell us about Homefront in North Carolina and the impact of the Homefront.
Before we begin, Nick, I want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership in not only founding but building this museum. It is an extraordinary institution. The people who come here love it. Everywhere I go and I talk about the World War II Museum, people praise it, they love it, they think it's fabulous. And I just went through the Homefront exhibit here in the museum, which is brand new, and it was just outstanding. It's beautifully done, it's done accurately, it's done with a sense of history, and it's the way this museum has been put together. And it's really been a marvelous achievement by you and your staff. But you're the guy who had the vision and the commitment to bring it to fruition.
Well, we say that when we're sitting in the Stephen Ambrose reading room, so we ought to mention Steve Ambrose, whose photographs are right behind me, and the typewriter that he worked on, and my best friend, and the original idea was his, and of course he left us in 2002, so we've had to carry along without him, but there's a lot of memories because these are all his books here. So let's talk about North Carolina and the Homefront, because you just went through the Homefront exhibit in this museum. Let's see how North Carolina fits into it.
Well, as every case, every state had an absolutely dramatic impact from World War II. Just to give you a brief idea, the federal government from 40 to 45 in North Carolina spent $2 billion, which is $32 billion in today's money. And the money is spent infrastructure, building Fort Bragg, building Camp Lejeune, on and on and on. And it changed the state of North Carolina because in 1940, North Carolina was 45th out of 48 states in per capita income. The average education of a white male was 7.9 years, for a black 5.9 years. 1/3 of the roads were paved. 2/3 of the state was rural. Only 1 in 8 farms had a telephone. Only 1/3 of the farms had electricity. There was no state medical school. There was no dental school. There were no community colleges. This was, in 1940, a backward state. And the most dramatic example of that is, in the Selective Service Act of 1940, North Carolina had more rejects than any other state in the Union. 45% of the people who were called up for selective service were denied. 72% were denied because of some sort of physical ailment. They had flat feet or one eye or tuberculosis or something like that. So many of them had dental problems. And then about 28% because they were addicts or had mental problems, or a huge percentage were illiterate. And so many of these people suffered from the diseases of poverty, from pellagra and all of that. And it was a disaster for the state of North Carolina. And so World War II sort of woke them up. It was called the Rip Van Winkle state, been asleep all these years. Finally, when they get these dramatic figures about how bad the health and education system is, they're going to use a lot of this money that comes in World War II to begin building up the state.
So what happened in the state? What were the big things that happened from the beginning?
Well, of course, the major thing is that over 2 million troops were trained in the various forts. There were probably 100 forts or installations or all kinds of airfields, that sort of thing. So the state just boomed. A good example was at Fort Bragg. In early 1940, there were about 5,000 troops at Fort Bragg. They had about 350 buildings. In December 1941, there were 90,000 troops and 3,500 buildings, all in the space of a year. So Fayetteville suddenly becomes the 3rd biggest city in the state. And all of this is overnight, and it's jobs, because they're building the fort, and they're building rail lines, and they're putting in electrical. Everything is changing the whole focus of this city, because now it's one of the key forts in the country. And another example is a little bitty town in North Carolina, which ended up being the basis of Sherry Point. The town had 28 people. In 1 year, there were 100,000 people in that same area. And again, these towns are just, it's instantaneous. I talked to a farmer. He said, well, he said, you could work for 50 cents a day plowing, or you could go to Fort Bragg and make $7.20 a day. He said, that was not a hard decision for me. He said, farm work was hard, and we were poor. And he said, this is a great opportunity. So part of what happens now is you're going to get urbanization. People coming in from the farms, they're going to work in the textile factories. You're going to find innovation, farming changes. Instead of just mules, now they're going to have tractors. The educational system has changed, particularly at the end of the war, when we're going to get the GI Bill. Everything in the state is impacted, particularly textile, lumber, all the industries. And so suddenly, North Carolina's out of the Depression.
Okay, so we're in 1942 and 43. I mean, this beginning, this dramatic transformation is going on. Cherry Point, Fort Bragg, they're all exploding. But we're in a war. I mean, this is this is all being caused by the war since Pearl Harbor, and so you've got a nation that feels under siege. The Germans were thought to be right off the coast, and in fact they were. The Japanese, they were wondering, were coming across the Pacific to attack West Coast states. But they were actually right off of North Carolina, the Uboats, the German Uboats. Tell us what was going on at Torpedo Junction, which you talk about in your book.
It's hard to imagine, in a way, from January 1942 to July 1942, German U-boats were off the entire East Coast, but they sank some 80 merchant vessels off of North Carolina, because North Carolina has that very problematic sand, and the currents change is difficult on the best of days. So what the German subs would do, they would go over and they would submerge all day, and they would come out at night, and they would have the sense that these ships were easy pickings because they had not cut back the lights on the shore. So the merchant ships would have their lights cut, but they were silhouetted against the lights on the shore. And one of the German U-boat captains, he said, we were like a wolf in the middle of a pack of sheep. Said it was easy pickings, we just took them down. And of course the dramatic impact is on the people at Ocracoke and on the North Carolina islands. They would get up at night and see these incredible explosions of oil tankers. They would also see bodies float up. They would find that there were all kinds of people who were terrified that the Germans were not only at sea, but they had infiltrated the coast.
There were rumors that they were on land and
Absolutely.
in there amongst them, weren't there?
And there was a rumor that went around at the movie theater in Morehead City that they had found German newspapers left. There was, my favorite story was, there was a woman with a German name, and she had a little place with a dock on the outskirts of Ocracoke, and they had determined that she was refueling the German U-boats, which would have been difficult since her dock was in about 3 feet of water. but they literally ran her out of town. And so the people were terrified that something was going to happen immediately. And so there were these rumors of saboteurs, and they were landing. My favorite story is, and I discovered this reading in local newspapers, a lot of good human interest stories. They had these local gendarmes who patrol the waterfront, to check on, see if any U-boats showed up. And they looked, and there were these red lights flashing on and off, on and off. And they got their guns, and they sneaked down, and they found this automobile flashing the red lights. And they checked, and they looked in the car, and there was this young boy and this young girl engaged in having a good time. And in the throes of passion, the young man's foot kept hitting the brake pedal. It kept coming red. And so that's how, they had their guns out. I don't know what they expected to find, but the people became somewhat terrified. And you realize as the bodies were washing up in the
It was serious business.
It was serious business. And they understood how valuable these merchant ships were. If the ships did not get to our allies, didn't get to Britain, you could lose the war.
Right. And there were lots of U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico, and lots of stories, none of them proven that we had our people who were out there those occasions of taking food out to the U-boats and fueling them up too, and stories about U-boats coming up the Mississippi River. But anyway, that didn't happen. But the rumors were rampant. Well, and of course, it wasn't just Fort Bragg. You have some famous flight school in Chapel Hill that grew up for pre-flight training, and people might be interested to know that there were some extraordinary athletes that have become legendary in the period, both some before the war already and certainly after the war. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those professional baseball and football players that were there? And they actually put a team together at one point, but who were some of the big names?
Well, it was naval pre-flight training, so their athletic teams were the Cloud Busters. The baseball team, the key was Ted Williams and Johnny Pesky. The entire team was made up of major leaguers, and they would play the other training schools, and they were fabulous games. The football team, the quarterback was Otto Graham. One of the coaches on the football team was Bear Bryant. And if you were to go to any one of these games, they were hugely popular. Of course, in World War II, people were glad to have this kind of entertainment. But they were such good athletes. Perhaps more important were two of the individuals who served there. One was George Herbert Walker Bush, who had dropped out of prep school and decided not to go to Yale and was going to be a Navy pilot, and he came to Chapel Hill. And then Gerald R. Ford was a physical fitness instructor while he was there. And this completely changed Chapel Hill. These universities would have had to close down because all the guys had gone into the war or had gone into some sort of public service or gone to work for one of the textile plants, whatever. And so they had no students to speak of. So by bringing in, they trained 18,700 pilots during World War II in this little town of Chapel Hill.
Weren't there some movie stars there too?
Well, they were, yeah, when they came to sell bonds, they came to Chapel Hill, and Clark Gable and
Clark Gable was there. Yeah.
Mickey Rooney and his new bride, Ava Gardner, who was from Smithfield, North Carolina. They drew a huge crowd. I mean, they drew thousands of people who came to see them. Because at that time, Mickey Rooney was the #1 box office star in Hollywood. Hard to imagine, but
it was. It was.
So to bring this,
and there was a band too.
Even more interesting, they had a B1 band that was designed to play music for the pre-flight school, but also they played jazz and they played dances and they played concerts. And Roosevelt determined that the B1 band, 46 musicians, should be all black, and they should all be from the state of North Carolina. And they were really the first to break the color barrier. They were musicians second class. They weren't really in the Navy, but they worked with and for the Navy. And they were great musicians. They could play all kinds of music. And just to make that one transition, not that they were part of the Navy, but that they were part of the pre-flight school, and they integrated that group, and the state, the local people supported it.
That's amazing. If y'all are just joining us now, we're talking with Dr. Julian Pleasance and his book, The Homefront, North Carolina during World War II. And if you hang on until the end, we'll give you a way that you can get a discount. I'll give you the code number, and University of Florida Press, which has it out. Everybody in the country was involved with rationing, and there's no exception in North Carolina. So what were the ration items that were most desired? And I think there's always some interesting stories around the rationing process. Why don't you tell us about the rationing in North Carolina, Julian?
The key item, as one might imagine, was gasoline. And they had a rationing system, so if you got an A card, you drove less than 6 miles a week. A B card, you drove 6 to 10 miles a week. And then there was a coveted C card, which gave you unlimited mileage. Of course, that was restricted to police and doctors and people who were in key industries. So there was always this fight for these coupons, and there was a lot of black market stuff. So always gas, but the biggest item were tires. You couldn't get tires. An example, the federal government allocation of tires to the state of North Carolina, January 1942, is 1,600 tires for the entire state, over 4 million people, new tires. So you couldn't get new tires.
And why were you not able to get tires?
Well, they went to the military.
They went overseas, yeah, went to the military, okay.
They
So
were using them up on Jeeps
Jeeps and everything else, yeah.
And so the tires were so important because you could sometimes get gas, or you could do the black market and get gas, but you couldn't get tires. You could recap what you had and all that, but it was hard to get them. And I came across a story of a well-to-do woman had this beautiful new car, brand new, and she stops and goes into a store and leaves on the front seat her purse and jewels. And she comes out, the jewels and the purse are there, all 4 tires are gone. And the thief had left her a note. Roses are red, violets are blue. Your jewelry is nice, but your tires are new. So all the tires were gone, brand new tires.
Where did you find that story? Was that in the newspaper?
I happened to find that story in the Southern Pines Pilot, which was my hometown newspaper.
All right.
And they always had these human interest stories. Another source that I thought was, well, I didn't realize that every camp had a newspaper. And I read in one of the Greensboro, which was a sort of a training center for Air Force, Chuck Heston was married in the Methodist Church. And this, of course, is Charlton Heston, Ben-Hur, all of this. And I also read in that same thing that they had a famous New York pianist who had been spotted mowing the lawn with his delicate fingers. And so these local news sources had sports headlines and what was going on at the camp. Fascinating insight as to what was happening with the training. But the big item, as you can imagine, that people hated to get and couldn't get, sugar. The average American in 1941, average American consumed 115 pounds of sugar every year. And for them not to be able to get the sugar was bad. And what they did when they started the rationing, you had to tell them how much sugar you had, because you could only get 1 pound a week. And so a lot of people were hoarding sugar. You know, they might have 6 pounds and they would declare 1 pound and get the rest. But it was a terrible blow to people who couldn't get sugar. I mean, they could turn to molasses and, you know, they could make substitutes. But for sugar, gas, and tires, those were the things. There was also a black market, if you can believe this, in bubble gum for kids, ice cream, and Pullman tickets. You couldn't get around in the car. So if you get a ticket on the train, that was a big deal. But most of those tickets were reserved for troops who were moved around. So people were bidding to get Pullman seats or ice cream for the kids. I mean, it was a very interesting process, and rationing worked. In 42, the consumption, civilian consumption of gas was down 20%. This is North Carolina. In 43, down another 20%.
And there were also scrap drives too. It wasn't just rationing. There were scrap
yeah.
drives going on everywhere in the country and North Carolina as well, right?
Absolutely. And what
kids were involved with that as well.
That was the thing. You get these kids, they pull their little wagons around, load up all the scrap and take it down. What they wanted more than anything else, obviously, was aluminum. They wanted copper, they wanted iron, and they really wanted rubber. So if you had any old hoses or any old activities that you've been involved in that use rubber, anything, tires on your little bicycles, they take those tires off, pots and pans. And one of the things I kept coming across is they needed tin. So you couldn't get toothpaste unless you turned in the old tube, which had tin in it. So to get a new tube of toothpaste, you had to turn in an old tube. And they had these kids around collecting paper and all of these items. And I'm convinced that they collected about 500 million pounds more than they could ever use. But nonetheless, it was important because the kids were participating in the war effort.
Yeah, everybody was involved. I mean,
Yes,
it was
exactly.
the whole country. It's one of the great stories we tell here at the World War II Museum is
Exactly.
about how this whole country unified around this war effort. People have forgotten that this was really a fight to the finish. That we were had two powerful empires arrayed against us, the Germans and the Japanese, and we were totally unprepared at the beginning of the war. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about military preparedness in the context of all those bases and how many troops trained in North Carolina?
And again, there were about 2 million. The one area that intrigued me as much as any place was Camp Lejeune. And Camp Lejeune was important for a lot of reasons. Obviously, it's one of the basic training camps for the Marine Corps, and it was an area where they trained for amphibious landing. And that's going to be important later on, obviously. But also at Camp Lejeune, and I had no idea about this, there were women Marines. I didn't know they had one. I knew about the other women's Army Corps, the WACs, that sort of thing, but I didn't know they had women Marines.
We had women Marines volunteering here in the museum in the last 10
Yeah.
years. Not any longer, but we did. Veterans.
And they had the Montford Point Marines, which was the only black
African American.
military training unit for the Marine Corps. Now, they trained at a separate part of the base. They were segregated, as was the military pretty much all through the war. But the very fact that the Marine Corps, the last group to come to accept this training. And then the other part there, something I was fascinated by, is the devil dogs. These dogs were trained, particularly in the Pacific. They could smell Japanese 200 miles away, literally 200 yards away. And they could create information about the enemy because they were trained. They would either, their hackles would come up or they would point or something. And they could sniff out clay landmines. I mean, they were invaluable. They saved thousands and thousands of lives, and they were officially Marines. If they died, they got a Marine funeral. But it was very interesting how they used those dogs and how effectively they used them. So Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point were critical. That was the Marine Navy training center.
And the population of North Carolina during the war was what?
Increased 500,000.
What was it start with?
4.5 to 5 million.
4.5 to 5. How many servicemen served? We heard about all the rejections, but how many actually served from North Carolina?
Well, again, it's hard to imagine exact numbers, but 350,000 is the general number. And it probably would have been more had a lot of them not been rejected. And 7,000 paid the final price for fighting in World War II. And North Carolina had 7 Congressional Medal of Honor winners. Farabee, who dropped the atomic bomb, was a North Carolinian. And there were quite a few real heroes from North Carolina in World War II. And North Carolina was one of the best at purchasing war bonds. The state always exceeded its quota. So partly because of the military tradition in the state and because of the bases. But North Carolina was then and is now highly attuned to military activities, military training.
Aside from the female Marines, there were other females in training in World War II in North Carolina. So why don't you talk a little bit about them?
My favorite group are the WASP, Women's Air Service Pilots. And there were about 1,100 of them, and they went through rigorous flight training, and their job was to save a pilot by transporting the planes as they were manufactured to wherever they were going to be used, to the base. And these women would get in these planes, they'd pick them up at the factory. They had no idea how to operate. I mean, the factory, they just made them and they took them out on the runway, and these women pilots got in, flew them where they were
They
going.
were the test pilots.
They were test pilots, and exactly what they were. They were test pilots, and a fair number of them died in ferrying these planes. But it was very essential for them to do that. They were wonderful pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody ever gave them, women can't fly planes, for God's sake. Don't trust them with that. It was kind of like the idea of the Tuskegee Airmen, African Americans can't possibly fly planes until Eleanor Roosevelt went up with one of them, proved to be exact. And in the Women's Army Corps, when they started, the commanders didn't want them till they found out how good they were, and they wanted more of them.
That's right.
And one more thing, sorry, the WASP also, part of their job was to fly targets for the ground artillery. So they would have these large targets attached to the planes, hoping that the people who were being trained were fairly accurate in shooting at the targets and not hitting their planes.
Weren't they towing other planes or gliders?
They would just tow a target behind their
Right.
plane. And again, occasionally they would come back with some holes in their planes, but most of the time the target was the object.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize. I mean, they ferried planes overseas. They ferried them everywhere, and they. Paul Tibbett tells a story about when down in New Mexico when they were training pilots for the B-29s for the Manhattan Project to fly. Ultimately, they didn't know this at the time, but they were learning to fly the first B-29s, which was a huge plane compared to the B-17s, and it scared these young pilots who hadn't flown one that big, and planes had already been flown in by the gals. And so they flew them in, and then the guys weren't going to get in one. And Tippett said to the girls, "Said, we'll go show these boys how to fly this plane." So they took off and came back and said, "Now, what do you guys want to try now?"
Well, they flew everything.
They
flew
did.
P-51s. They
They
flew
did.
Dauntless. I mean, I was really impressed with how And the bad news was they would never, ever, the WASP were never part of the military. They were civilian.
Mm-hmm.
They had to provide their own transportation, their own uniforms, and when they left the service, they didn't get any burial, any benefits whatsoever.
But our own Lindy Boggs from Louisiana helped to get the WASP's veterans benefits many, many years later.
Yeah.
So they now do. Tell us about Alice McGuire.
This was a young 18-year-old woman who, from the piney woods of North Carolina, who somehow ended up at Aberdeen Proving Ground where they were testing all the new weapons. And they didn't have enough men to test these weapons. And she had determined that she was a crack shot. She could hit a squirrel at 200 yards. They brought her in, and this is sort of let's just say a hefty young woman who was not allowed to play on the boys' football team because she was too tough for them. She gets up there, and turns out she is a sharpshooter in all of these weapons, and she is wonderful at testing them out. And they asked her, well, how did you get into the job of testing weapons as a 18-year-old mountain girl? She said, well, it's hard to tell what's men's work from what's women's work in a wartime.
That's a good
She
line.
was 18 years old, but she understood that things were starting to change.
And as the war went on, you got a lot of German POWs in the state. Tell us about them.
10,000 German POWs, 3,000 Italian POWs.
Excuse me.
And the German POWs were used rather effectively as workers. When they first came, they were incarcerated. But because, particularly on the farms and in the textile mills, again, young men had gone off to war, and they needed people to bring in the crops and produce fertilizer, whatever. So they made an arrangement with the War Production Board, and if you could state a need for labor, they would allow you to hire these German POWs to come to work on your farm and pick peaches or cut lumber or whatever job was needed. And it was such a big deal because it gave the Germans something to do. Plus, the federal government made millions of dollars because the individuals who hired the POWs paid their salaries to the federal government, and the German POWs got 80 cents a day to spend in the canteen for Cokes and whatever like that. And it turned out they were really good workers.
Germans.
They were Germans. Yeah.
Any of them escaped?
There were, in North Carolina, 29 attempts. All but one failed. 4 of those were shot and killed. The one that succeeded was amazingly at the end, almost at the end of the war, August 45. He escaped and finally gave himself up in 1959 after being free all that time. And finally it just worked on his conscience, and he went down and he said, I've been an escaped POW since 1945. But the other thing that I thought was important about it, these German POWs became good friends with a lot of people in the state. And a good friend of mine had told me this story. He said, a German POW gave me my first candy bar. My mother wouldn't let me have candy bar. And said, we were picking peaches, and at the end of the crop, we all worked together. Said, we've stayed in touch with these people. We've gone to visit them in Germany. They come to visit us. So there was hatred of the Nazis, but interacting on the farm, they became friends in many cases.
It happened in the state too.
Yeah, and I think that was now these were not the first prisoners were Rommel's African Corps. They were hardcore Nazis, nobody messed with them. They ended up putting them separate. They wouldn't let them go out and work. But they were, later, the younger ones were more willing to accept. They were much better off in North Carolina than they would have been in Berlin.
Oh yeah, a lot of them were glad to be there.
Oh, absolutely.
That had a chance at life.
Absolutely.
Well, it's I think what you've been saying, Dr. Pleasance, is talking about how everybody in North Carolina society, as well as throughout the whole United States, many families were involved, from brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, kids, right down to 7, 8, 9 years of age were out in the scrap drives or tending to Victory Gardens. So the whole country was involved in this. And one of the things that we do at the National World War II Museum is we try to help families find out what their families did in World War II and what their father or grandfather or uncles did in World War II. And so we're developing some capacity to develop genealogical services here. We're also working with the federal government, the Department of Defense, that is looking for some 85,000 missing in action and POWs from World War II and all wars. And we're part of their network of researchers to try to help find those. But the main thing is to say that the family stories of North Carolina are rich indeed, and people are interested in connecting back and finding out what their families were doing in the war. And it was just as important what they did at home as they did overseas. So, well, it's been an engaging hour, and I want to again mention the book that we're talking about for those of you who tuned in late. It's Homefront, North Carolina during World War II. And the author is my good friend, Dr. Julian Pleasance. And his publisher at the University of Florida Press. It's an expensive book, but there's a lot in it. So it's $89 normally, but for anybody who wants to read about North Carolina in World War II today, you have a special code that you can use. If you have a pen, write it down. It's AU Alpha Uber. AU 717. AU 717. And if you call the number at the University of Florida Press, 1-800-226-3822. 1-800-226-3822. They will give you that discount if you give them that code number, and you can buy this wonderful book for $45. And if you miss that chance, come to the World War II Museum and you can buy it right here. So, Julian, thank you very much. Been a lot of fun. I'm sure everybody's now interested in looking in their own backyards and find out what happened in Texas or Des Moines or California or Pennsylvania or wherever you all are out there. But no matter what, you're part of this World War II Museum family. And stay tuned. There's more coming. Bye-bye.